Chapter 9 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 9. "That was a handsome woman with Lucilla Dennison," said Sheridan to his companion, as the vehicle rolled past them. "She is an old friend of my own," returned Lyttleton. "Indeed! I did not see you speak to her." "I was uncertain as to my reception," said Lyttleton. "Is that so?" The tone was rather rallying. "Not that — not what you think," returned Lyttleton, too emphatically to be reassuring. "But it is a unique story. Come into my rooms and hear it." They turned from the main road and threaded some dull by-streets into a square, with dusty trees and patches of green impounded like a strayed piece of country between bars of iron. The near branches sparkled in the gaslight, and in the darkness beyond some unforgotten remnant of natural melody was shaken out by these poor harpers from the forest. Leaving the square, they came into a more frequented street where were a block of chambers. Before one of the outer doors Lyttleton paused, and this being opened, the two mounted the stairs together to the fourth story. Here they exchanged the dim light for a bright, well-furnished room. And here, by the fire, lit even so early in the season, Sheridan sat down to hear Lyttleton's story of the rector and his daughter. He told it well, with sympathy, even with emotion. "What will he do with the tithe?" said Sheridan, sharply, when he had finished. "Not let it go back into the landlord's pockets, I hope." "No. He is a churchman through and through, and considers church property sacred, particularly the tithe. I believe he will no more surrender it than he will use it for himself." "Then what is the upshot?" "He collects it as usual, but every farthing goes for church or church schools or charitable purposes." "That's better. How did his bishop take it, I wonder?" "Oh, his bishop sneered condescendingly. He professed to fear lest the action might seem a movement of self-exaltation at the expense of the general church body." The rector's reply was, however, given in such a spirit of sweetness and retiredness from self that in the end the bishop let Mr. Kemball take his own way. "You see, the rector is deeply respected by the dignitaries of the church, and he could hardly be snubbed too severely for a desire to follow Christ literally. If the example caught on, it would be awkward for some of our church magnates, I suspect. But now look here, can't we work something out of this?" Lyttleton's eyes laughed as he quietly fingered his beard. "Mr. Kemball did not come at his ideas through our movement," said he. "I know that, but it helps to show that our movement has come out of everything else." "You are perfectly scandalous, Sheridan. You think of nothing but seizing the opportunity." Sheridan smiled. "What else is there to seize?" said he. Lyttleton laughed again. "I grant our movement has come out of everything else. The wind bloweth as it listeth." "That is so. But there is nothing against our putting up a windmill or two to catch it." "Sheridan, you are shamelessly prosaic. We are told that Socialism is a dream." "Let it be a dream, then. When I get a good dream, I'm not satisfied until I've done something to cage it." Lyttleton turned and silently regarded his friend with amused, affectionate eyes. Sheridan, unconscious of his look, was staring rather gravely into the fire. The light played over his face, which was always eminently expressive. Leslie had found in the man something unique. He had strongly attached himself to him in a selective and enduring friendship, one founded upon a profound compatibility at the bottom of two natures otherwise apparently dissimilar. Paul Sheridan's history was of the kind which, in the case of an ordinary man, might have sunk him into a complete rut of the commonplace. His birthplace was London, a fact in itself indicative of an absence of romantic or striking background. Moreover, he came of a family occupying a respectable but narrow position in the lower middle class. He was born into a world which presented from the beginning a prosaic aspect. There was no glitter or colour of any sort in the opening years of his life. From any false idea in his estimate of his own position in the environment in which he found himself, he was debarred. The brilliant, the unusual, the picturesque were wanting. The basis of things for him was prose. Again, he was familiarized early with the idea that the means for his existence, with all that such an existence might come to imply to himself, were to be won by his own application and effort. That is a lonely thought, but it is one which has a fine effectiveness, and no child of the nation should be debarred from acquiring it. Something, of course, Paul owed to ancestry. He came of good wholesome material, and brought into the world with him unusual mental powers. That he possessed a very deep imagination of a particularly masculine type no one probably suspected. Yet it was this hidden imaginativeness, this wide-sided discriminating power of mental vision, which differentiated him from his fellow men, and gave him that unique quality which was destined to bear fruit in his life both for himself and for others. A great characteristic such as this bears others in its train, and many unusual attributes, both of heart and brain, clustered round this one of his hidden imagination. Meanwhile, the utmost thing was his prose. Although Paul, by his position, missed the educational advantages common to a lad of the upper classes, he had his opportunities, and his early training led him to embrace them eagerly. What education he could lay hold of he took. From a child his mind ran into the business of acquiring knowledge and information, and very early gave indications of its special tastes, for from the age of 13 onwards he found pleasure in collecting statistics and pasting or entering them into a book. A fact was his delight. He liked to know the bearings of a thing, its present limits and powers of growth. He liked to test and examine, and he would watch from year to year how a thing developed, and would measure it in figures. All parts of life attracted him. The manoeuvres of an army excited pleasurable mental feelings, and he would copy a battlefield out of a newspaper with tin soldiers and chessmen on a table, and perform the scientific part of the warfare over again in mimic evolutions with his toys. Science, too, he loved, because it showed him how things were done and how they had come about. But as he became older, his particular intellectual quality showed itself in a passion for economics and history. He had passed every examination, and competed for and won whatever prizes were open to general competition, and had earned enough money to go abroad and study for a time in Germany before he was 21. But it was after that age that he began to make a mark as a student of and writer on economics. Meanwhile, the business of earning his own living was always before him. He went into the dull daily duties of routine work with the same effectiveness and energy that he put into his self-chosen occupations. If any one remarked upon his equal devotion to small things as to great, he looked surprised. "How am I to know that the small things may not turn out to be great?" he would reply. With this passion for detail and strenuous habit of living straight into the moment, it was to be expected that by the age of 22 Sheridan should find himself in a good position. He became confidential clerk in a first-rate business house, with a rising salary and the prospect of a pension or partnership in the end. Just at this point, however, calamity overtook him. It is possible that, had it not been so, Sheridan might have fallen into mere successful routine, and never have found the greater self which lay enshrined within that hidden and little suspected imaginative power. And yet the imaginative power was always there, and where there is gold, life mines and probes until it is brought to the surface. She struck her pick now where he was most sensitive. He found himself under a charge of gross neglect amounting to dishonesty. Sheridan had no means of disproving his guilt, or in the least accounting for what had occurred. The real delinquent, a clever scamp, had so managed matters that the charge could neither be proved nor disproved against Sheridan. He was subjected to all the humiliation of an examination by his chiefs without coming off in it triumphantly. Having regard to his immense services, he was not discharged. Indeed, he was grudgingly acquitted. But the eyes with which he was regarded became cold and changed. The event shook Sheridan in every part of his nature. It was agony to his sensitiveness, a quality which underlay his masculine strength in unusual power, as it is sure to do in any highly gifted and well developed creature. He saw himself rejected, condemned, and misjudged in those very qualities which he was conscious were of particular worth to the persons on whose behalf he had exercised them. Sheridan was an intensely proud man, proud in that silent, strong, unostentatious way which is better than humility. A vain man would have resorted to pettish resignation of his post as a protest against the indignity of suspicion. Sheridan did nothing of the kind. He argued to himself that such a step would be to surrender a part of his own position. What had happened was due not to anything wrong in himself, but to the stupidity of his chiefs, who mistrusted the quality of a man who had served them. He hated in a quite human, unsaintlike manner the fellow clerk who had laid the trap for him, and despised from the bottom of his clever mind the idiocy of the employers who fell into it and misjudged him. "But that's not my concern," said he. "If they are fools, there is no need why I should be one too. If this had not happened, I should have gone on in this particular path, and I'm not going to be pushed out of it now." So he went on day by day, just as if it had not happened. So far went his will. But to his sensitiveness it remained agony. And under the hand of this suffering his imagination awoke and lifted him up. This was a time of an all-devouring energy of work to Sheridan. He wrote, lectured, studied, and he examined every possible phase of life that came before him. And suddenly, through the eyes of his own suffering, he saw clearly, imaginatively, potently, the suffering of his fellow men. It rolled up before him in an intensely vivid presentment that shook him to the heart. And with a man too wholesomely occupied to be tempted to dwell on the emotional side of life, this disturbance of the nature was genuine and profound, and the precursor of lasting results. He was not moved now to forget upon the morrow. The experience cut deep into his heart and formed the starting point of a new departure. Out of the present emotional moment was born the idea which he was hereafter destined to follow with increasing zest and persistence. The idea had two sides. He saw himself in the first place as the avowed servant of humanity, and he saw humanity in the second place as something capable of being effectively served. Humanity, those broken, disorganized, degraded shreds of it which flitted across his path every day of his life, and which he viewed now with the new eyes of his own suffering, was pursued to his inner vision perpetually by the hopeful figure of redemption. Present to his view in the warped type was the might have been, and close upon that smote into his mind the determined it shall be. The poetry of Sheridan's nature had been born in pain, but it was of a high quality and bore no trace of emotional weakness. He first accepted with firm compliance his own particular burden of bitterness, and then threw it aside with the brief decision of one who perceived that the casual smart hardly signified in comparison with the daily breathing tragedy of broken, wasted life ever present to his knowledge. The simplicity of the issue to all this unusual emotion was characteristic of the man. He merely registered a vow never to refuse any public duty, great or small, that might come in his way. Few have insight enough to perceive how far-reaching and strong is such a determination towards the singleness of duty. It was a clue to a quiet persistence in his methods that was in after days to prove somewhat provoking to less balanced minds, and was even to be the occasion of misunderstanding and false estimation. Something, however, from the outside world was destined to be added to Sheridan's experience in this moment. He came into contact with the socialistic idea, then crude, obscure, and hardly to be calculated upon in the sum of agencies. For half a century the stream of Socialism had run underground. It was just reissuing into the light of day. Sheridan met with some of its adherents, studied it in the works of Karl Marx, Proudhon, and other lesser but more modern exponents. His quick mind leapt to the idea, overhauled it, appropriated, and changed it. It is not too much to say that Sheridan's conversion brought about a new era in the history of Socialism, a fresh phase of it which, lasting or not lasting in its particular form, was fitted to the needs of the age which had brought it forth, and was destined to be powerfully effective and influential within it. Meanwhile Sheridan had dreed his weird. By imperceptible degrees, and by sheer persistence in duty, he had regained his position in the estimation of his chiefs. Finally, a complete answer to the charge laid against him was suddenly brought to light, whereupon an ample apology, promotion, and compensation were offered him. Sheridan, however, had lately felt that his occupation in a house of business, even one that paid trade union rates of wages to all its employés, was too cramping for him. It limited his opportunities, hampered and curtailed his spirit. He needed and sought a wider world in which to exercise his powers, and freer occasions in which to pursue the now leading idea of his life. He resigned his position, therefore, and entered into the precarious but much more influential life of a journalist. Such had been his existence for a couple of years before he met with Lyttleton. At the time of his encounter with his future friend he was a well-known writer, not only in the newspapers, but also in the leading reviews, the peculiar turn of his political ideas rendering him invaluable to any editor anxious for the admixture of originality and glowing conviction amid the learned, stately, and less aggressive articles that make up the ordinary material. The advent of Lyttleton into Sheridan's life was quickly followed by another pleasant event. After a lecture on Socialism at a public hall in London, a young girl advanced from the audience towards him, and holding out her hand with a mixture of timidity and fearless innocence in her bearing, informed Mr. Sheridan, who had accepted the small fingers tendered to him in shy gravity, that she wished to throw in her lot with him and his friends, because she believed that every word he had said was true. Sheridan was touched, pleased, and embarrassed by the incident. Women moved a little outside his plane, and he was troubled by a feeling of the strange and unaccustomed in dealing with them. The girl, who seemed extraordinarily young, stood her ground with a patience and persistence that at least argued sincerity. "I am older than I look. I intend, if you will have me, to be one of you," said she quickly, when she remarked his hesitation. The girl was Lucilla Dennison, and the incident, which had taken place some 2 or 3 years ago, marked her entrance upon the life of a Socialist. Lucilla brought to the cause qualities of her own. The movements of her mind were large, single, clear. She was clever. Sheridan was apt to be a little impatient with mediocrity, this being a quality he could not understand, and soon became a useful lieutenant of the movement, being regarded by the rest of the band as Sheridan's particular convert, while on her side she attached herself to him as her chosen guide. Sheridan always regarded himself as being in some measure responsible for Lucilla, but indeed there was amongst the little band of comrades an easiness and simplicity of intercourse, born of coincidence of aim, which made the duty light. The aim was the diffusion of light and the acquirement of social knowledge, but the scope of the movement widened, and every day opened out some fresher possibility and some new field for effort. Meanwhile there was in the character of Lucilla a region of reticence and reserved force which Sheridan felt that he did not touch. Occasionally he speculated upon this element of resistance in a girl so slight and enthusiastic, and so yielding to his lead in most things. But the speculation never went further than an interested thought or two. Lucilla was his very good comrade, and none could more reverently leave alone than could Sheridan the circle of reticence and reserve in another which he so pre eminently respected in himself. Lyttleton's friendship was a great gain. He brought with him an element of culture as a university man, of culture of a special quality in which Sheridan's education, thorough though it was in some respects, was wanting. Leslie's occupation in London was that of a civil servant, and this fact, together with certain of his characteristics, kept him a little in the background at a time when Sheridan was stepping more and more forward into public life. But on the whole the two men ran abreast in a generous give and take friendship. Both aimed more and more consciously at definitely throwing their ideas into administrative form, the gradual realization of socialistic notions in legislation, and in municipal control being the life task which Sheridan, with the full concurrence of Lyttleton and others, placed before himself. Lyttleton, who was still smiling at the evidences of his friend's habitual alertness after opportunity, stretched his hand towards the mantel shelf for a pipe and lights. He offered a box of cigarettes to Sheridan, who, however, shook his head and declined them. "Lucilla Dennison introduced me to Miss Kemball after the lecture," said he, "and I saw at once she owed me a grudge. I hadn't the faintest idea why. Was it because of the part about the church?" "Of course. Conceive the effect of your admonition on the daughter of a clergyman." "But she does not agree with her father. She ought to have been glad." "Well, it appears she wasn't. Did she say anything?" "No, she looked it." Sheridan laughed softly. "I'm afraid she was very much offended with me indeed. However, I don't pretend to be a man to make favourable impressions upon women. I don't know how to do it. Of course I wish I did, except that a perfect manner argues a wasted youth." "Miss Kemball's manner can be very pronounced at times," said Lyttleton, gravely and with recollection. "Oh, very. However," added Sheridan, "I believe I can pardon anything to anybody the moment I understand it." "I believe you can. By the way, did you notice how pale Lucilla Dennison looked to night?" "Yes. I don't know what is coming over her," said Sheridan, frowning and pulling his moustache. "No one can explain it if you cannot." I assure you I cannot. I haven't any direct clue. Sometimes I think she is disappointed with the movement. Possibly with me. There are offences, of course. The claim of the community upon one's service leaves little time for self-culture. But she should accept this. Yes, but I question if she sees why the idea of self-perfection has to be dropped by anyone whose social consciousness is enlarged. The pursuit of self-culture is a very expensive and all-absorbing affair. We have not the right or the time to undertake it as a prime object, while the whole race is enslaved to hard conditions. Our bit of work is to ease and lessen the general slavery and degradation. We can only do that by taking on ourselves some of the defects of servitude. We lose ourselves to find ourselves. I would suggest that we have no right to occupy ourselves with ourselves at all. I have no time and no heart for this self-culture. And as for Lucilla, I've offended her ignorantly, no doubt," said Sheridan. " But if she liked me once, she ought to go on liking me." "Sheridan, I don't suppose for one moment she has left off liking you." "What is it all about, then?" Sheridan again slowly passed his hand — it was a lithe and rather graceful hand — over and over his moustache. "Unless, indeed Is it true that she has formed an acquaintance with Achille d'Auverney?" "I don't know. I can hardly fancy it. You see, personally, I detest d'Auverney." "I'm not sure that I detest anyone. But I don't agree with d'Auverney. The man's a patent absurdity. What does Lucilla want to foregather with him for?" "You and he are on a different tack altogether." "Well, I am then, and I'd rather be. I don't understand why he should have an attraction for Lucilla. But it's astounding what a fascination the red cap has for a woman. They will run at the heels of any scamp who takes liberty as his view hallo." "That is because they haven't got hold of the right thing. I can understand their running after liberty, but Lucilla ought to know better. D'Auverney is no sort of a chap." "D'Auverney is hot for violent revolution, and you are against it. The former is the more picturesque." "Lucilla isn't that sort. I'm against violent revolution because it defeats its own ends. Of course your genius, Sheridan, lies in your instinct after the trend of events." Sheridan laughed. "The most rigid conservative has that too, only somnambulistically. He finds himself moved on by the sheer impetus of events to the position of last century's advanced thinker. I have no doubt that Tom Paine's idea of old age pensions will be a future conservative electioneering cry, and that a conservative government will bring in the bill. I had an idea, a general sort of idea, about these things which I believe would work up well into a lecture," said Lyttleton. "We shall be wanting one soon, and you might as well take it. What is the title? Will it work up into a tract?" "Sheridan, you must know that this is an opera in words. There are the orchestra and overture, the dramatis personae, and the story in the songs." "I'm afraid I don't see a tract in it then. But fire away." Lyttleton had, it appeared, occupied some of his spare moments lately in contemplating the evidences of transition in the present phase of society, and in curiously speculating upon the elements that went to make up this whole effect of a social environment in the uneasy condition of solution, of change into something else. The spirit of the age was, he found, characterized by movement, by excessive movement as distinguished from periods of comparative stagnation, and was manifested in a variety of activities which, often apparently contradictory, and being each one of them solvents, yet conveyed onward through this period of transition some one dominant note, which in his opinion was to be an essential element in the next more established phase. The idea had sprung into his mind upon his meeting with so living a survival of the Oxford movement in Honora's father, a survival which, as distinguished from mere persistence, had accommodated itself in his spirit to the modern call and the modern need. Lyttleton took therefore as his point of departure the Oxford movement in the earlier decades of the century, and coupling with it the contemporaneous appearances of Chartism, of Carlyleism, of Christian Socialism, accepted them as manifestations of the early Zeitgeist, conveying a note of abnegation of the individual self rather than the realization of the social self. Viriliter age expectans dominum was, he took it, the spirit of mediaeval revivalism at Oxford, and though Carlyle's ideal differed and was wider, and that of Chartism and Christian Socialism was so again, yet in all of them was a similarity, for in each a stern and splendid inspiration was limited by the individualistic tendency to a dogma, a tyranny, a programme, an attitude of personal benevolence. Such spirits as Matthew Arnold and Clough he took next as forming a century influence, which from particular characteristics he would name la maladie du siècle. In them the dominant peculiarity was regret, the mourning of great souls destined to officiate at the sacrifice of a past that was beloved and scarcely able to welcome the advent of a future whose strangeness and newness appeared cold and repugnant. Yet from them had passed out the lasting note of regard to proved truth as the only certain criterion, a note to be taken up in splendor by the modern scientific spirit, with Clifford as a fine exponent, and Spinoza as a sort of intellectual ancestor. After this came, in his opinion, the pagan spirit, so eminently a solvent. "As revived in our era," said he, "this is anything but festive. It is sheer despair, done into the best English by Pater and Swinburne. Side by side comes the aesthetic feeling, a fastidious fuss about exquisite detail. Then comes the revolt in hope. Morris, you know, splendid old Morris. Then all mine and all thine shall be ours. Illustrated by Walter Crane. Brotherhood and haymaking. Lastly, we have constructive socialism, enthusiasm done into dry work. Finally, realism, the crusade against shams. Blake, Ibsen, Zola, Maupassant, Turgenev, etc., etc., all the eminent unrespectables. And to cap all, we have pseudo-realism, the affectation of truth." Lyttleton threw himself back in his chair, stretched out his feet to the fire, and looked at his friend with a challenging smile. "Is that all?" asked Sheridan. "Not all, but all I feel inclined to mention for the present. I've skipped ever so much." "There's not any more just now?" "Not for the present." "I'm rather glad of that. And this is the overture?" "Yes, but I ought to have put constructive socialism last. I ought to have ended in the realization of the social self to which the whole leads up." "Well, it's a very handsome gallimaufry, and I suppose Wagner would do it into music. I should like to hear the Century Orchestra. But now get on. I'm quite ready for the dramatis personae." "Oh, didn't I bring them in at the beginning?" "Not at all. I tell you what, Lyttleton, having listened so far, I'm not going to be put off with the overture. I want the songs, the general stage behaviour." "The stage behaviour that is as it may be." "By no means. I'm sure there's something feminine at the back of all this. There's a she in it somewhere. There always is. I want you to trot out that interesting creature, the Century woman. You can't expect me to give her up." Leslie drew his feet back, leaned forward in his chair, and placed his fingers together with a quick movement. A dark flush came into his face, and he began to speak with cutting bitterness. "She? The Zeitgeist makes her, I suppose, out of the weaker, harder side of everything. You get her from the wrong side of Arnold, conceited, scornful. She takes up science in a glib surface way, and thinks she has the final word on her tongue's tip. She plays with the pagan spirit, delicately of course, and without coarseness or offence. She assumes the aesthete, and thinks fastidiousness a sign of elevation. In her pseudo-realism she affects the truth, and in her affectation of it shows herself a noodle." Sheridan received this speech in silence, but on his lips hovered a smile compounded of amusement and kindliness. After the pause had lasted a few minutes, he spoke in a soft and even tender tone. "I very shrewdly suspect that she has a fine, tall figure and a handsome face with well coloured cheeks and good eyes and eyebrows. Lyttleton, I'm afraid you admire Miss Kemball very much indeed." Lyttleton frowned into the fire. "Well, I must be off," said Sheridan. "I meant to have gone home early to work half the night over the leaflet against leasehold enfranchisement. The subject is coming on in the House directly, and we ought to be beforehand with our information." "Oh, damn the leaflet! It won't make any difference." "On the contrary, it is very good business. That leaflet has got to be ready for the press to morrow." "Begone, then," said Lyttleton. "I'm in an ill mood to night." "Then I'd better be off, of course." No sooner, however, had the door closed behind him than he opened it again. He came back and sat down on the corner of the table. "Lyttleton," said he, without preliminary, "why not try and induce her to come again? Obviously there is Lucilla Dennison's influence to count on." Lyttleton stood on the hearth, both hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the carpet. "There is a great deal in making up one's own mind," added Sheridan, with his warm, kind smile. And then he got off the table, nodded good night, and vanished. CHAPTER X.